It is April 1945. A muddy, unpaved roadside outside Erfurt, Germany, cuts through a landscape ruined by heavy artillery. Mud splashes against the side of an American command car as a motorized convoy rolls past a deep drainage ditch. Inside the trench, a lone human figure lies crumpled on the wet earth, surrounded by discarded gear and empty shell casings. A sudden halt breaks the mechanical rhythm of the advancing column. The sound of a desperate, repetitive cry rises above the idling engines, drawing the immediate attention of the supreme commander. No one expects a hardened general to stop his entire armored advance for a single dying enemy. Yet a single decision at this crossroads will reveal exactly what Patton did when he found a teenage adversary facing his final moments. This is the story of a powerful American general who paused an entire armored column to show mercy to an individual foe. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show humanity in the darkest places. The man trying to save a life in the mud was Technician 4th Grade Donald Miller, a 24-year-old combat medic from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, serving with the 80th Infantry Division. Before the draft took him, Miller had worked in a quiet family bakery. He had never intended to witness the tearing of human flesh. He had survived the freezing misery of the Ardennes, patched up dozens of screaming men under mortar fire, and lost his closest childhood friend to a sniper outside Luxembourg. He carried no weapons, only canvas pouches filled with sulfa powder, morphine syrettes, and heavy white bandages. He had seen every imaginable horror that steel could inflict on a human body. Yet, nothing had prepared him for the absolute futility of the muddy trench outside Erfurt, where he now knelt in the freezing drizzle, looking down at a dying child. The boy in the dirt was Hans, a 16-year-old conscript from a small farming village near Weimar, wearing a coarse, oversized Volkssturm uniform that practically swallowed his slender frame. Hans had been forced into service just 3 weeks prior, under a desperate decree that swept up children and old men to defend a collapsing regime. His short military career consisted of 1 week of drilling with a wooden rifle, 1 day of marching, and 5 seconds of terror before an American artillery fragment tore through his abdomen. He possessed no grand ideological convictions, no medals, and no understanding of the geopolitical forces that had placed him there. His only remaining reality was the agonizing fire in his stomach and the terrifying knowledge that he was completely alone. He lay in the cold mud, clutching his torn uniform, crying out repeatedly for the one person who could not save him. The Allied advance across Thuringia in the spring of 1945 had broken the German army into scattered, bleeding fragments. The Third Army was moving at an unprecedented pace, covering dozens of miles a day, bypassing fortified cities, and leaving vast pockets of unclean territory in its wake. The standard rules of engagement were disintegrating under the sheer speed of the offensive. Supply lines were stretched to the absolute breaking point, and communication between units was often reduced to erratic radio static. In this chaotic environment, local commanders were forced to make immediate, unilateral decisions regarding prisoners, wounded combatants, and the waves of displaced civilians clogging the muddy roads. Most frontline officers simply pushed past the human wreckage left in the ditches, focused entirely on maintaining the momentum of the advance. There was no time to stop for individual casualties, especially when those casualties wore the emblem of the enemy. The war had reached a level of administrative coldness where numbers mattered more than names, and speed mattered more than basic human sympathy. Medical units were overwhelmed with their own wounded, and divisional guidelines strictly prioritized American soldiers over captured hostile forces. It was a brutal math born of necessity, and hundreds of dying foreign conscripts were abandoned to the elements without a second glance from the passing columns. Yet the relentless mechanical roar of the Third Army convoy could not completely drown out the raw, elemental sounds of the battlefield. The division had encountered plenty of resistance in the woods surrounding Erfurt, but the fighting had quickly dissolved into a series of small, desperate retreats by disorganized local militias. The main body of American armor continued its push toward the east, leaving behind a trail of burning equipment and shattered infantry. The routine business of war continued without interruption until the lead vehicles neared the shallow drainage trench where Miller was kneeling. Miller worked quickly in the mud, his hands slick with rain and blood as he tried to secure a fresh bandage over the child's torn abdomen. A young operations officer from the divisional staff, Captain Arthur Vance, walked down from the edge of the road, his polished leather boots sinking into the wet clay. Vance looked at his watch, then looked down into the drainage ditch with an expression of cold impatience. He told the medic that the column had to resume its march toward the next objective immediately. Miller did not look up from his work, continuing to apply pressure to the heavy white cotton pad. He said that the boy could not be moved because any sudden shifting would cause immediate internal bleeding. Vance stepped closer to the edge of the trench, pointing toward the passing tanks. He stated that the divisional guidelines were clear, and American medical supplies were strictly reserved for Allied personnel who could be returned to the front. He added that the boy was an enemy combatant who had been wearing a hostile uniform when the artillery struck the tree line. Miller wiped the freezing drizzle from his eyes and adjusted the boy's oversized coat. He replied that the casualty was not a soldier, but a 16-year-old child who had been pulled from his home less than a month ago. He argued that the boy was completely helpless, entirely unarmed, and would not survive the hour without a final dose of morphine to ease his passing. Vance shook his head, his voice tightening with bureaucratic authority. He declared that a uniform was a uniform, regardless of who was forced to wear it. He said that the state had conscripted the population to fight, and the boy had to accept the consequences of that choice. He ordered the medic to pack his canvas pouches, abandon the position, and take his place in the rear medical vehicle before the armor cleared the sector. Miller looked at the captain, his voice dropping to a sharp whisper. He refused to leave the ditch, stating that he would not abandon a dying human being to freeze to death alone in the mud. He said that if the military police wanted him out of the trench, they would have to drag him out themselves. Vance realized the situation had escalated beyond his immediate authority on the roadside. He turned around, walked quickly back toward the idling command cars, and signaled for the staff radio operator. The urgent message regarding a direct refusal of orders by a frontline medic reached the Supreme Commander's vehicle within the hour. Patton's command car pulled up to the edge of the drainage ditch with an unannounced suddenness that caused the roadside staff officers to snap to attention. The general stepped out of the vehicle into the freezing drizzle, wearing his immaculate, tailored winter uniform with 4 silver stars gleaming brightly on his helmet. His signature ivory-handled revolvers hung silently from his belt, and his face remained completely unreadable as he surveyed the mud-splattered scene. He walked down into the ditch, his boots crunching against the wet clay, and stopped directly beside the kneeling medic and the dying teenage conscript. No one spoke a word, and the entire area fell into a heavy, tense silence as every man present waited for the commander to speak. Patton looked down at the boy and asked how old the casualty was. Miller wiped the rain from his face and answered that the prisoner was roughly 16. Patton then asked when the boy had been wounded. The medic replied that the fragmentation shell had struck him about 2 hours ago during the initial artillery barrage. Patton stared at the oversized tunic and asked if the boy had any weapons when he was found. Miller shook his head and said that the trench contained only an empty canteen and a single personal letter addressed to Weimar. Patton studied the boy's trembling hands and addressed the gathering officers. He said that a child in a uniform was not an army, nor was he a grand political threat to the Western Alliance. He stated that the leadership in Berlin had resorted to the ultimate cowardice by pulling children from schoolhouses and forcing them to face veteran armored divisions. He noted that the boy had been a soldier for less time than it took to die from the metal that tore through his flesh. He pointed toward the road and remarked that the Third Army did not make war on terrified children who called for their mothers in the mud. He declared that a true warrior understood the distinction between a defeated enemy and a dying human being who possessed no further means to resist. Patton turned back to the boy, took off his leather glove, and knelt directly in the wet clay. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a single, unlit cigarette, which happened to be his very last one. He lit it with a silver lighter, held it carefully to the boy's trembling lips, and allowed him to take a slow drag. The German youth looked up at the silver stars, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and sudden relief, and tightened his fading grip on the general's bare hand. The dying German boy took a final drag from the cigarette, his tiny chest rising and falling beneath the wet wool of his oversized tunic. The harsh smoke curled lazily toward the gray Thuringian sky, mixing with the freezing drizzle that fell across the roadside. Patton stood perfectly still in the wet clay, holding the boy's hand until the tight, desperate grip of the youth began to slacken and grow cold. The weeping stopped entirely, replaced by a heavy silence that settled over the entire drainage ditch. The general slowly withdrew his hand, stood up straight, and looked down at the pale, motionless face of the 16-year-old conscript. Patton turned to his nearby personal aide and held out the remaining glowing stub of the cigarette between his fingers. He ordered the officer to ensure that the small piece of paper was buried directly with the boy in the mud. He then instructed the surrounding divisional staff to bring forward a proper burial detail immediately to inter the deceased youth with full military respect on the roadside. The gathered American officers, who had previously demanded that the trench be abandoned, watched in absolute silence as the commander issued the directive. No one questioned the delay, and no one spoke as Patton walked back up the clay bank and returned to his idling command car. Donald Miller returned home to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, after the general demobilization in late 1945. He married his childhood sweetheart, reopened the family bakery on Main Street, and spent the next 4 decades quietly serving his community. He never joined the local Veterans of Foreign Wars post, and he never spoke to his children about the fields of Thuringia. He kept a single rusted German canteen inside a locked wooden box in his attic, the only physical proof of the hour he spent in the mud near Erfurt. He lived a quiet, unassuming life until his death in 1988. Captain Arthur Vance remained with the occupational forces in Frankfurt until 1947, before returning to a corporate law practice in Boston. He climbed the ranks of civic society, rarely spoke of his frontline service, and died during a winter storm in 1992. His personal journals, donated to a local university library after his passing, contained only a single brief line regarding the advance through central Germany, noting that the column had been delayed on a secondary road due to an administrative matter handled directly by the Army commander, General George S. Patton never recorded the incident in his official diary, and the event was completely absent from his public statements during the final weeks of the European conflict. He kept the small report filed away under miscellaneous correspondence in his personal staff desk until his sudden death in December 1945. He mentioned the encounter only once in a private, handwritten letter to his wife, noting simply that the most difficult part of the advance was looking into the eyes of a child who had been dressed up by desperate men to play the part of a soldier. Some historians have argued that the encounter on the road to Erfurt was a rare, unauthorized deviation from the strict military discipline required to maintain a rapid armored offensive. These critics suggest that a field commander cannot afford to compromise tactical momentum or divert staff resources for an isolated, terminal casualty belonging to an enemy force. Others have argued the opposite, maintaining that the incident demonstrated the deep personal integrity of a leader who refused to allow the brutal conditions of total war to destroy his basic sense of human decency. What is certain is that the brief halt on the muddy roadside remained etched into the memories of every soldier who witnessed the Supreme Commander kneel in the clay. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have ordered the column to press on without stopping? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about humanity in the darkest places, make sure to subscribe.